Good afternoon, and thank all of you for coming out. And I mean all of you. This is one of the biggest crowds I've seen here in a while. My talk today is on the Florida Keys, one of my favorite subjects. And I know the past couple of years I've talked a lot about the science, shown a lot of the data we've collected in the Keys. Some of you probably saw Corals at the Crossroads, a documentary about that work. Today, I'd like to step back from the research a little bit. I do have one slide of data for the scientists. But I'd like to really kind of focus on kind of the human perspective of the reefs in the Florida Keys and how that has changed really over the centuries. And so the talk today could be considered historic. And at the end of the talk, I'd like to wrap up with kind of an overview of the work we're doing with NASA, using satellites to monitor the health of the coastal waters in the Florida Keys. Now that we're doing this kind of work, we can really claim we're doing rocket science here at Harbor Branch. Okay, what is a reef? Well, the primary definition is a narrow ridge of rocks or sand, often of coral debris, key term there, at or near the surface of the water. Now, it has a secondary meaning in the field of mining as a lode or a vein, as in gold. Now, we are going to be talking about gold and silver reefs in the Florida Keys for any of you that are interested in treasure salvage. And then there's a third definition for all you nautical wheelers out there, and that's a part of the sail which is rolled and tied down to reduce the area exposed to the wind. That's somewhat relevant to the talk today as well, because you can just think of those Spanish sailors who left Havana back in the 1600s, sailed into a hurricane in the Straits of Florida, and were busy reefing those sails as their ships were being blown apart and sank on the reefs of the Florida Keys. So we're going to briefly talk a little bit about that. So the different types of reefs that one can encounter, of course, in the Florida Keys are, as we just heard, coral reefs. That picture in the upper left is elkhorn coral. It's the primary reef-building coral that built the reefs that we see today when we go out and dive on those reefs. That particular photograph was taken in the Abacos in the Bahamas. We no longer have a lot of that coral in the Florida Keys. We've lost over 98% of it in a regional mass extinction that I'm going to talk about in a little more detail. To the right of that is the floating seaweed, pelagic sargassum, a brown seaweed that we've done a lot of work on in the Florida Keys. It's important in connectivity between coral reefs of the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Florida Keys in terms of fisheries recruitment. I'm not really going to talk much about that today. That's a whole nother talk. But the bottom left, you can see some gold. Down there, we're going to talk a little bit about those types of reefs. And over to the right bottom, artificial reefs. And what we'll see in this talk today is how increasingly the Florida Keys is depending on artificial reefs as we lose the natural coral reefs. Well, when you go to the Florida Keys and drive down the overseas highway, as I know many of you have, you're actually driving in the upper Keys and the middle Keys on fossil coral reef. This formation is known as Key Largo limestone. If you look carefully at the photo on the left, that's a shot of the wall of the Marvin Adams Waterway in Key Largo. And what you can see is actually a fossil coral. It's about 6 or 7 feet tall. This is the coral Montastria annularis, a big star coral. Probably that specimen was hundreds of years old. So that formation extends all the way down past Marathon into the lower Keys around Big Pine Key, where it meets the other major formation, Miami Oolite. Now the Miami Oolite is composed of little carbonate grains, oolite formation that are all calcified and cemented together. Not nearly as much fun to look at as the fossil Key Largo limestone. But the difference in geology was very important to our studies of septic tanks in the Keys, because we had to measure the hydraulic conductivity of these two different formations. And it turned out that that Key Largo limestone, on average, was about 10 times more porous. It would pass these septic plumes much faster than the Miami oolite in the lower Florida Keys. Okay, the wrecking era. I think many of you are familiar with this term. It began about 500 years ago when the Calusa Indians who lived in the Keys would paddle their canoes out to the reefs to salvage early explorers that would run aground on the reefs. And this was nothing for the Calusa Indians because they used to paddle to Havana for mojitos, I guess, and beyond. But it was really, I guess, after a lot of the Spanish treasure galleons sank on the reefs that the Spanish salvors came to try to retrieve some of the lost Bank of Spain that was sitting in and around the reefs of the Florida Keys. But perhaps the most famous era for the wreckers was in the mid-1800s, when Bahamians, many of them from Green Turtle Key and the Abacos, moved to Key West to find their fortunes in the wrecking industry. One gentleman, William Curry, moved to Key West at the age of 18 and became Florida's first millionaire. And today in Key West, you can see his mansion, the Curry Mansion on Caroline Street. Well, it was during this period of the mid-1800s when so much money was being lost by merchant mariners running aground, insurance companies having to pay out a lot of money, that a plea was made to the federal government to erect lighthouses to allow safe passage around the Keys reefs. And unfortunately, that didn't help a whole lot. Oftentimes, it lured more ships onto the reefs than not. But this was also a period when these pleas for help from the federal government to the federal government were made to study the Florida Keys reefs, to see what could be done about getting rid of the coral. That time, it was such a menace and problem for navigation that there was a lot of sentiment that wanted, these reefs to go away. So Louis Agassiz was commissioned. He was the Swiss naturalist from Harvard that went down to the Florida Keys with a project of surveying the reefs to see what could be done about getting rid of them. And this is what he wrote back to the superintendent of the Coast Survey. He could not see the possibility of limiting in any way the extraordinary increase of corals beyond the bounds which nature itself had assigned to their growth. So obviously, since that was written, we have figured out how to get rid of those reefs, as we're going to see today. And it's interesting to note that that Coast Survey at the time was the predecessor of NOAA today. Okay, that'll come back up in the talk. Another ship that ran aground on the reefs of the Keys, one particular reef that's very close to my heart, is the HMS Loo, a British frigate carrying 44 guns, ran aground, hard aground in the middle of the night at Loo Key in February of 1744. And got a picture of Loo Key there, you can see it. It was salvaged in the 1950s and studied by Mendel Peterson of the Smithsonian Institution, who worked the site with someone that's very dear to our hearts here at Harbor Branch, Edwin Link. And the photo on the right is a great photo of Ed Link up on the mast, rigging a block and tackle to raise a 1-ton iron cannon from the bottom at Loo Key. Now, if you look at the size of the boat he's working from, this gives you an idea of the kind of engineering genius Ed Link was. He safely brought that anchor up, cradled it alongside of this beautiful mahogany hull, and safely got it back to Marathon. Of course, that was the 50s, okay? A few years later, Ed founded and developed Lapointe, where we are today. Now, the photos on the left, as Dennis pointed out, I came here actually in 1974 as an employee for Woods Hole. You see the photo in the upper left, Lapointe. That's the entrance to Harbor Branch that you all just drove in to get here. That's what it used to look like in the day. And just below that is a picture of the original aquaculture project. I think you're all familiar with all the great things that have happened here at Harbor Branch in the aquaculture project. That is where everything began, that little project, which involved recycling nutrients from our sewage plant here at Lapointe through a polyculture system, removing the nutrients so that the water leaving the system was actually cleaner than the water coming in from the Indian River Lagoon. And off to the side on the right, you see that picture of Ed Link and Roger Cook. Roger was the first director of marine operations here at Harbor Branch with a Johnson Sea Link in the background. Well, that was an interesting period here at Lapointe. In working at the aquaculture project, I got to run into some very interesting characters. One of these being Fay Field. Upper left-hand picture shows Fay working on the magnetometer that he pioneered, and eventually developing the proton magnetometer, key innovative technology that led to the discovery of the Margarita and Etosha in the Florida Keys. Another thing he worked on, little known to many, worked with Mel Fisher of Treasure Salvers, and I'm sure Ed was involved in this too, in developing the mailboxes. These are the apparatus on the stern of these Treasure Salvers vessels that deflected the prop wash down to the bottom where the divers were picking up the gold. And the problem was that these near bottom layers were often turbid, either from storms and times of the year where the divers couldn't work. So Mel and Fay both were focused on water quality. They asked, how can we get the clear surface water down to the bottom so we can see the gold and, better yet, pick it up in our hands? And so that has worked very well to get the clear water down to the bottom and also to dust the bottom to remove the sand from the gold and other artifacts. Okay, just yesterday I received this photo from a friend down in Key West, Don Kincaid, who worked with Treasure Salvers back in the early 70s. Great historic photo showing Mel Fisher, Fay Field, and then all the way over to the right, that's Ed Link, with a Johnson Sea Link. They're tied up at the dock in Key West. And as I think all of you know, the 16-year search for the Etosha finally paid off July 20th, 1985, just a few years after I arrived to start our field station on Big Pine Key. You can see the cannon, one of the key pieces of evidence leading along Kane's Trail as they used those mailboxes to search for the ballast pile. And on the right, I'm sorry, I know you can't see very well what's in those photographs, but those are the silver bars that were finally found in the ballast pile of the Etosha. They weigh about 70 pounds each, and they were stacked like cordwood, 3 feet tall on the bottom, and went for 30 feet or more, a true reef. They were covered with lobsters in July when they found them, but the divers at the time just worked around the lobsters. Okay, well, it was really the 60s and 70s, the same time frame, that it was clear these reefs were beginning to be degraded by human activities. One of the problems was harvesting of coral, increasing tourism and population growth in South Florida. A lot of people wanted a piece of that reef for their living room. And so souvenir shops from Melbourne to Key West had a lot of living coral harvested in those shops to sell to tourists. You can see that historic photo on the right. That's a photo from the Florida Keys. Clearly the hands of man were at work underwater. And it was decided in 1960 to designate the first marine protected area in the Keys, John Pennekamp State Park. That was followed in 1974 by the state of Florida declaring the Florida Keys an area of critical state concern, meaning everything, all the development in the Keys was to be reviewed by the governor and cabinet. That was over concern about pollution emanating from the Keys, destroying the reefs. Then in the 70s, 1975, Key Largo National Marine Sanctuary, 1981, Lou Key. And then by 1990, it was obvious that these weren't working. It was decided by the federal government we needed to make the entirety of this area a marine sanctuary, and that's what happened in 1990. Well, about the same time, there was another visionary by the name of Art Marshall. I wonder, is that name familiar to anyone in here today? A few people? Okay. Art was at that time, the director of the U.S. Bureau of Sport Fisheries, based right here in Vero Beach. Today, it's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Vero Beach. And he had incredible vision and foresight to see what was happening to Florida. Of course, in the 60s, after the Cuban Revolution, we saw a huge expansion of sugarcane agriculture in the EAA on the south rim of Lake Okeechobee, right in this area. And because of the back pumping from that ag area, all the muck, that these farmers were working in, lowering the water levels to farm, they had to back pump into Lake Okeechobee, or send that water either east or west to the canals to southeast Florida, or from Lake Okeechobee down the Caloosahatchee River to the west coast, or the St. Lucie to the east coast. And Art saw firsthand what was happening to water quality in Lake Worth and our estuaries, and it wasn't a pretty sight. And at the time, the water managers, called the Flood Control District, was primarily concerned about controlling water levels in this human-dominated system in South Florida. So to them, it was more an issue of water quantity. But what Art Marshall saw in his vision, that the real problem is that water quality is a far graver problem in the long run than is water quantity. And that's going to have special meaning for the Florida Keys, because he knew at the time the water managers were trying to save Lake Okeechobee from all this back pumping, and their intent was to move this water southwards through Shark River Slough, this way where it discharges around Cape Sable. And right there is in the hip pocket of Florida Bay, upstream of the very sensitive coral reefs of the Florida Keys. Well, let's fast forward to 1990. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary has expanded, and there were two big concerns at the time. Ship groundings were still a concern. We had several of those in the 80s, but the biggest concern was the deteriorating water quality in the Keys. But interestingly, at the time, it was politically incorrect to bring forward all the evidence we had gathered that this problem in Florida Bay was a result of pollution from agriculture up in the EAA coming through the Everglades. We were in the middle of the Everglades lawsuit at that time. It only recognized the phosphorus pollution as it pertained to the Everglades. It wasn't politically correct to extend the problem to Florida Bay and beyond. So they came up with an alternative theory as to explain the algae blooms that were happening in Florida Bay and the Keys. And that theory was that the water had simply become too salty in Florida Bay. And they knew they could fix that problem by pumping more water from Lake Okeechobee down into Florida Bay. Easy fix, and the fix was in at that point. So between 1991 and 1996, increased discharges were sent south. This is what the bottom of Shark River Slough looks like. And you can see there's not a lot of people living over there in the 10,000 Islands area, so no one could really see firsthand what was happening, except us. We knew this was going on, and this is the first time we began to monitor this with the help of satellites from space. This is one of our early images showing the bloom, the algal bloom on the western side of Florida Bay in green. This is a Landsat image showing it moving across Florida Bay towards Long Key, the Channel 5 bridge in the Florida Keys. Okay. Another satellite image, this is 1996, getting a little more sophisticated, better technology in space to look at water quality. What we're looking at here is the turbidity. After 5 years of increased flows of water and nitrogen loading coming into the western Florida Bay region, the red color denotes very high turbidity, phytoplankton blooms and resuspended bottom sediments as a result of all the seagrass die-off, particularly on the western side of Florida Bay. But you can also see the damming effect of the Florida Keys, how it kind of holds this turbid water in the backcountry of the Keys. Here are the Marquesas, of course, where Mel Fisher and Treasure Salvers is working on the Etosha. And this extends all the way out to the Tortugas. You can also see how this water is coming through the tidal passes of the Florida Keys. Well, this is what the water looks like in the Western Bay if you fly over it. This is the park tour boat here. You can get on down in Flamingo and go out and look at this area yourself. It looks pretty much like this today. This was, once upon a time, not too long ago, clear water with seagrasses on the bottom. But you clearly can't grow seagrasses in that kind of water quality. Well, the reefs just downstream of this area in western, well, actually in extreme southern Florida Bay, took quite a hit when this happened. This is a photo of a brain coral, 1988, at one of our favorite dive sites, the Rock Pile. This brain coral is 3 or 4 feet tall. You can see the green filamentous algae already growing over the coral, indicating clearly at that time this area was already stressed by elevated nutrients, or that green algae wouldn't be there. That's a clear ecological indicator. Well, look what happened. 10 years later, after the flooding of the bay, we went back out to see how this reef looked, and as you can see, it wasn't very good. We couldn't find any living coral at all at this site. It was covered with cleonid sponges, those orange sponges, and algae, Caulerpa racemosa. It's this little green bubbly plant we see here. And since that time, of course, things haven't gotten much better. Some of the players changed names. In 2008, that's a plant we call Cladophora liniformis that formed very extensive blooms. So that reef was comprised of brain corals. There was an area about the size of a football field that died in the wink of an eye from this management action. Those corals, again, had been growing there for hundreds of years. 1996, at the peak of the water input to Florida Bay and nitrogen loading, we had an extensive bloom of Lyngbia, all the way from the bay, all the way out over the outer reefs. And this is continuing today. We still see a lot of cyanobacteria in that system down there, as we do in many parts of Florida. It's a real concern, not just because of the environmental issues of these degraded reefs and dead zones, but human health issues. These cyanobacteria produce a lot of nasty chemical compounds, tumor promoters, other compounds that have been linked to Alzheimer's disease and ALS. So the concern about this getting into the food web, or some cases drinking water, is of real concern. Well, the water wasn't just in the bay. This turbid water obviously is flowing through the tidal passes to the outer reef. And we followed up Ed Link's work at Lou Key by putting together our long-term water quality monitoring program at Lou Key, centering it there. And so this is my one and only data slide for the scientists here. And I'm going to kind of walk you through this. Turns out that this is the longest record of low-level nutrients for a coral reef anywhere in the world. We started this in 1984, and I'm presenting the data here today, decade by decade, to show you what's happened decade by decade over the past 3 decades. We've got it in the 80s, the 90s, and then the decade from 2000 to present. And in the study of nutrients and eutrophication, we of course want to quantify nutrients, ammonium, nitrate, DIN is the addition of ammonium and nitrate, that stands for dissolved inorganic nitrogen. And then we have soluble reactive phosphorus all the way on the right. But one of the best indicators of these nutrients is phytoplankton algae in the water, single-celled algae that we measure as chlorophyll A. And so if we first just look at the chlorophyll A, we can see in the 80s how that was the lowest level of algae in the water over the last 3 decades. And that with the water additions and nitrogen loading coming into Florida Bay in the 90s, it went up 3-fold on average for the decade. And as that water was diverted elsewhere in the late 90s and since 2000, you can see how that chlorophyll has come down. So we rank these 3 decades as kind of the good decade of the 80s, when we still had a pretty good reef down there at Looe Key. A bad decade of the year 2000 to present, when we don't have much of a reef left, but the chlorophyll has gone down significantly since the 90s, and then the ugly decade of the 1990s, when all this was going on, this experiment of adding all this water to Florida Bay. Well, you can see in the ammonium and nitrate data the significant doubling of nitrogen. This is biologically available nitrogen that feeds the algae blooms and diseases on the corals. And then the DIN, you see that reflected in the DIN. And unlike the chlorophyll, even though the flows from the Everglades have gone down since 2000, the nitrogen hasn't. The nitrogen has kind of built up in the system, kind of like a dirty bathtub. It just hasn't gone away. And the phosphate has a slightly different pattern. It has increased stepwise, decade by decade. And the reason we know that this nitrogen in the 90s is from the Everglades, if you do the math and compare the DIN to SRP to get the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, you can see in the 90s that that ratio jumped from about 10-to-1 to 25-to-1. And that's because the water coming out of the Everglades has a very high nitrogen to phosphorus ratio of about 100-to-1 or higher. And so that's basically what happened. And unfortunately now, both nitrogen and phosphorus are over what we call the tipping point for a healthy coral reef. And we have to get those nutrients down if we're going to really see recovery in this system. Now, the good news is the state of Florida, DEP and EPA, under mandate as a result of litigation in 2008, are scrambling right now to come up with numerical nutrient standards, not just for the Florida Keys, the entirety of Florida's surface waters. And it's really built on this type of model of developing quantitative nutrient criteria that will help to clean up the major sources of nutrients that are causing this problem. Well, if you go back in the newspapers and look what was happening in the 90s, these are the types of headlines you saw. Every other day, you saw headlines like this: blanket of algae smothers Keys reefs. And you can see in the little cartoon, all this was coming basically from Florida Bay out towards the outer reefs. Not just non-toxic seaweeds, as we often study, red tides. The worst red tides the Florida Keys region had ever seen. These toxic red tides are normally distributed between Tampa Bay and Naples, but because so much water and nutrients were coming down into the Keys, it shifted that whole harmful algal bloom southwards. Finally, here in the Citizen in April of 1996, we get a headline saying, "Bay remedy could be backfiring." Okay, it wasn't just algae that were blooming, also bacteria. Okay, the beaches got shut down all the way from Key West to Key Largo and out to the Tortugas. Okay, because once the algae bloom and grow, they die, fall to the bottom, decompose, and are actually food for bacteria, which consumes oxygen, and that's how we get dead zones. So basically, we were feeding this bloom of fecal coliform bacteria that included this particular little bug, Serratia marrescens, which is the white pox disease. And this is the disease, I'm going to take you through some slides, that actually killed the elkhorn coral on the reefs of the Florida Keys. This was identified by Jim Porter and his students at University of Georgia, and it's the first time that a common member of the human gut flora has been shown to be a marine invertebrate pathogen. Now just follow me through the slide sequence. You're going to see the recession of living coral tissue. This brown coral tissue is the living tissue. This is July 1994 at this reef off Key West. Here's 1996. You can see that white pox disease spreading over the coral. 1998, not much living coral left. Here we are, December 2000, pretty much all gone. And in the same time frame, the entirety of the Florida Keys lost 38% of its living coral and is down now to about 6% coral that's left on those reefs. Obviously, coral diseases are a big part of this problem. Next week, you should come see Josh Voss's talk. He'll be telling you a lot more about that part of this problem. So, as a result, habitat loss for corals. The water quality can no longer support their growth. So when you drive down to the Keys, it's not just the key deer on Big Pine Key in terms of an endangered species area. The entirety of the Florida Keys needs to be considered an endangered species area. Now, you saw the photos. I'd like to show you a little bit of video now. Jill, if we could run this video, I want to show you a before and after to give you a sense of how much habitat, reef habitat, was lost. This is elkhorn coral that we're talking about in the 1980s at Lou Key. And as we roll through this, you're going to see that this coral extends upward off the reef, providing three-dimensional habitat. All these copper sweepers you can see here in and around the coral. And as we move forward, we can see these schools of snappers, groupers, and grunts that use this particular habitat as nursery habitat. Now we're looking at just what the water quality used to look like at Lou Key when we had that low chlorophyll level at Lou Key. These are some of the soft corals. You can see that they're very clean and healthy, free of epiphytic algae and diseases. And we're going to take a look at some of the brain corals. Same type of coral we saw at the rock pile on the bay side. Of course, this one's at Lou Key in the 80s, before the flooding of Florida Bay, Barracuda, Standing Sentinel. And Lou Key was such an amazing place. This is down under the coral spur and groove zone along the sides of the coral fingers, a couple of snook passing by. Okay, now we're going to fast forward from the 1980s to the year 2000. Okay? This is habitat loss. No habitat, no fish. Okay, we have done fish census work before and after in a marine protected area with no fishing pressure, and it's not a pretty sight. It's not all due to overfishing. Okay, you see that the reef surface is covered here with some macroalgae, other opportunistic organisms. These are the dead skeletons of elkhorn coral that are becoming bio-eroded by a number of different forces. And that's pretty much what you see today if you go down to Lou Key. This is pretty much what you'll see. You look at a close-up, you can see some of these macroalgae. Interestingly, even though snappers, groupers, and grunts have decreased at Lou Key, the herbivorous fish, such as parrotfish and blue tangs, have actually increased because their food supply has increased. There's more algae for them to eat. Okay, well, there are attempts right now being made to try to get these reefs in recovery and get this elkhorn coral growing again. Stimulus money is going to the Nature Conservancy, $3.3 million to try to set up a coral nursery to grow 1 acre of elkhorn coral, okay? And obviously all of this, the beach is getting shut down, dying reefs and dirty water has not been good for the economy of Monroe County. So the story is we have really come full circle today. Over the past several decades, as the natural reefs have been in decline, the Keys have relied more and more on sinking ships deliberately as artificial reefs to support a struggling economy. One of the most recent of these is the Spiegel Grove that was sunk off Key Largo in 2002, 510-foot-long ship, put in about 130 feet of water. It went down sideways initially, but Hurricane Dennis in 2005 turned it upright. So everyone's happy again about that. The most recent artificial reef is the Vandenberg project off Key West. Now the divers down in Key West didn't want to be outdone by Key Largo. They wanted an even bigger ship. So they got the Vandenberg. It's 10 feet longer than the Spiegel Grove, 520 feet. And of course, like all the artificial reefs, they promoted this, on the basis that we need this to strengthen the ecosystem, improve the fishery, relieve pressure on the natural reef from divers, and also to develop recreational attractions for diving, snorkeling, fishing, educational research opportunities, and to preserve history. They did a lot more work on the Vandenberg than any of the other ships in terms of preparing this, and they really did a great job. They penetrated the hull, they Swiss cheesed the hull to allow divers easy access in and out of the hull. Okay, you can see the Swiss cheesing effect. And as we'll see, the stair towers and elevator shafts also allow divers to penetrate all the way from the upper decks all the way down inside the ship. The shallowest parts of the ship are the satellite dishes, come up to about 40 feet from the surface, and the ship sits in about 140 feet of water. So how many of you have been down diving on the Vandenberg? One? Okay, well, no worries. We're going to bring the Vandenberg here today. We've got some video of it. Jill, if we could roll that next clip.
Built of steel back in 44. Her fate at birth to haul our troops to distant shores. To all the brave souls who walked upon her deck, we shall always promise never to forget. The mighty ship Vandenberg, she sailed all the oceans of the world. 500 feet of history making way. They're sinking the Vandenberg today.
That's Joe Weatherby, who spearheaded the Vandenberg project. He's the first real shipwrecker of Key West. Well, it was sunk last May, and we were talking with the dive shops in Key West about what was colonizing the Vandenberg. It's something that scientists were very interested in. There are a number of scientific issues. I mean, there's a lot of concern about disturbing natural reefs around these artificial reefs, the introduction of invasive species, for example, pollutants and contaminants that could be transported into these waters by these artificial reefs. So we had heard, here's the satellite dish covered with a lot of algae. We had heard that there were some big blooms of algae on the Vandenberg. This particular footage is from August, and we did not shoot this. This was shot by Tom Jackson, a colleague in Key West. But upon hearing of all the algae on the Vandenberg, we arranged to go down later in the fall. But you can see the red macroalgae, and there's some actually large green macroalgae as well, clearly telling us that this site had fairly high nutrient availability to grow those particular species of algae. Okay, this is one of the railings coming up. Okay, this is our video. When we arrived in November, shortly before Thanksgiving, of course, we were a day late and a dollar short. Hurricane Ida had come through about 2 weeks earlier and had scoured the wreck of a lot of that big algae. But nonetheless, we did find some interesting things. There were sea urchins starting to recruit that had come in. Of course, they eat algae. They're herbivorous. And you can see on the bottom, the whole ship deck was covered by this thick algal turf, this green algae. And this is something, again, that was very interesting to us because this is food for herbivorous fish. And as fish are attracted to these artificial reefs, you do get what we call a consumer-driven nutrient cycling going on as these populations of fish build nutrients up on the reefs, on these artificial reefs. We're down inside the hull now. There's not a lot of light penetration down in here, so you don't tend to find a lot of algae inside, but we wanted to look anyway, and we're headed up now back out to the radar dishes or the satellite tracking dishes to look for algae. And a lot of the algae that you had seen from August is gone at this point, but there were some thick growths of Dictyota, little brown seaweed that we're collecting. This is Chip, my assistant, and I taking photos and collecting this algae for chemical analysis, some of the small plants. And I guess this is about the end of our dive. It's time to get back to Duval Street and decompress. And so I'm going up to my safety stop. And Chip is giving me the high sign here. It's time for mojito. Okay. So just to close out that part on artificial reefs is this great quote from Jim Bonsack with NOAA, that artificial reefs are good tools to achieve ecosystem enhancement, but are not intended as replacement for maintaining water quality and must be used in conjunction with sound resource management. So just to close up my talk, I just want to briefly go through some of the really exciting work we're involved with today to try to really keep a handle on what's happening with the water in the Keys. Right after they sunk the Vandenberg, within the first month they had reduced visibility down to 5 to 10 feet, where it was of great concern even putting divers down on the Vandenberg. But looking at what we're doing now to try to look at these water masses in and around the Keys and maybe predict when that dirty Gulf water is coming towards the Vandenberg, is our work with satellite remote sensing imagery. And it's interesting because over the years there's been a lot of criticism of NASA and the space program by ocean scientists that these vast sums of money are going to explore space when we have relatively so few dollars to support our work here on Earth in the oceans. And it's interesting that Gilles Cousteau was an exception to this. He realized satellites were the only way to monitor the health of the oceans way back when. And some of the platforms we're using today are the new technology satellites like Modus Aqua, Modus Terra, to allow us to actually see these black water events coming out of the Caloosahatchee River, that image on the left, coming all the way to the Dry Tortugas. The panel on the right showing a pulse release coming out of Shark River Slough. That was back in 2002. Caused a lot of damage to the resource in the Keys. Just that one event showing this before and after shot of a reef off Key West that black water moved over. One of the things we're going to be doing is looking at these images with a new technique, an algorithm called fluorescent line height, that'll allow us to actually detect algae blooms, such as red tide blooms, out of the so-called CDOM, or the colored dissolved organic matter, which is this kind of black tea-like image that we see with these images. Also, one of the problems in remote sensing, if you're not there on the ground when that image was taken, you can never really be sure what you're seeing. And so this particular image from May of 2008, that's that rock pile area that I talked about earlier, north of Big Pine, shows a big chlorophyll signal of what would normally be interpreted as a phytoplankton bloom, but because Mark and Diane Littler and I were there underwater, we knew all that fluorescence was coming from a macroalgae bloom that was extensive, acres and acres and acres. So that's really what we're seeing here in this image. And this new NASA work, we're going to be working between Shark River Slough and that rock pile site to be able to calibrate and validate all those tools from NASA. So this is exactly what we'll be doing, validating all these ocean color images, looking at long-term baseline products, quantifying the status of water quality, and then helping the state and EPA develop these nutrient thresholds. So I would just like to close now and thank my harmful algal bloom team members. Charlie Yench at the top has been kind of a mentor to our program, founder of the Bigelow Lab. He also has helped NASA develop these algorithms for looking at ocean color. This is Chip Baumberger, Brad Bedford, my two assistants, Mark and Diane Littler, been part of our program for many years. Brian Cousin, videographer, who is an honorary member of the HAB team, comes to help us get videos at our sites. And Mike Risk from Canada, who has allowed us to use our isotopes in corals with like tree ring dating going back decades to look at how nitrogen sources have changed. All the funding agencies that have helped support the work in the Keys, and many, many people in the Keys that have provided information and support to us. And I'd just like to close with a little 30-second PSA. The Save Our Seas license plate, those funds that come into Harbor Branch help support the work we're doing that I've talked about today, that are really making a difference to protect Florida's water quality. So Jill, if we could just run that little clip, the happy birthday clip.
Happy birthday. I'm Brian Lapointe, marine biologist at Harbor Branch Oceanographic, reminding you that your license plate expires on your birthday, not at the end of the month. Before you renew, consider purchasing a Florida Save Our Seas license plate. Proceeds go to marine conservation, research, and education. Help save our seas now and for generations to come. Back to the office.
Thank you all.